Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Matt Brogdon, and I welcome you to our panel put on by Hesperus, Things to Know When Hiring Native Americans. Before we begin today, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement with Heather from Microsoft.
Yes, thank you so much. First, I wanted to start off with recognizing what is land acknowledgement. For many people that might be on today's call, you may not know exactly what that means. And so we'll be doing a land acknowledgement today, but it's really an opportunity to commemorate Indigenous peoples' kind of the principle to kinship to the land, the fact that we have not and cannot be erased from her, our collective first mother. And it's a starting place to really change how the land is seen, how it's talked about, and how we redefine how people place themselves in relation to First Peoples. So I just wanted to describe that because for many people on today's call, this might be the first time that you've heard it. For many of our organizations, it is common practice now to begin with a land acknowledgement before events. So I'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. And while we meet today on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands, which we all call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all First Nations people that call this land home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we are and can each in our own way try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Back to you, Matt.
Thank you, Heather. I really appreciate that. And again, welcome to everyone. I'm joined today by a fantastic panel, and we'll have them introduce themselves in just a second. I would like to introduce my team and really what we're doing at Hesperus. Hesperus is a nonprofit that we founded last year to support Native American communities through education, employment, and technology, including Native American veterans. I spent a lot of time in corporate America, especially in the tech and biotech space, and found that there was a conversation missing when we were discussing topics and diversity and inclusion, when we were talking to folks in talent acquisition, and then when we wanted to engage corporate leaders to broaden our corporate social engagement. I found that the Native American voice and people were not represented in so many of those meetings. And so we set out to create an organization that would include them at the table. And today we want to celebrate the fact that Native Americans make up a significant portion of the folks that we are engaging and hiring in companies all over the country, but many people don't know how or where to start when they talk about talent acquisition or retention or engagement in these communities. So I welcome everyone that's come today, that's registered, and I hope you get as much out of this as we will talking about all of these issues. I also want to recognize my team today, Charissa Wood, a member of my team and who does the tireless work around our social engagement and public relations, and Mike Moreno, who also supports us on the digital side, who's managing this presentation and panel today, and who makes us look great digitally. That being said, again, welcome, and I would appreciate if everyone would introduce themselves on our panel. Heather, again, we'll start with you and go from there.
Sure, happy to be part of today's discussion. I'm Heather Doran. I work for Microsoft, and I've been at Microsoft a little over 9 years. Currently, I'm Chief of Staff and Global Director of our Business Applications and Global Industry team, and part of the Indigenous ERG at Microsoft, also a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma.
And Tyler, if you want to go next.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us here today. My name is Tyler Hogan. I'm an account executive in North America sales for Nike. I work on our lacrosse and soccer business. I'm also the co-chair of Nike's Native American and Friends Network, our Native Employee Resource Group, as well as the vice president of the Native Youth Nonprofit Youth Movement. I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma.
All right, welcome. And for our East Coast representation, we have Clay Langdon from Cisco. You're on mute, Clay.
I'm sorry, this whole Zoom thing is in conflict with the superior product of WebEx. I feel a need to share that out there. But anyway, hi, I'm Clay Langdon. I've been at Cisco for about 8 months now. I'm a virtual sales specialist, and I'm also one of the educational leads for our Native American Network, ERO at Cisco. I have affiliation with the Eastern Band of the Cherokee and Seminole Nations.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. And we'll get into some sibling rivalry here. I'd like to introduce Fawn Sanchez.
Hi, everyone. I'm Fawn Sanchez, otherwise known as the older sibling of Furman Sanchez, who will introduce himself next. I am from Amazon. I've been here almost 8 years at Amazon, and I'm president of the Indigenous at Amazon Affinity Group, or ERG, and I'm also manager of our Global Enterprise Support Training Team in AWS. I'm Shoshone Bannock and also an Army veteran.
Go
ahead,
is it my turn now?
now?
Oh, great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Furman Sanchez. I'm an account executive at DocuSign. And aside from that, I'm a reserve Marine major assigned to the Marine for Life program. So I provide career assistance to unemployed and underemployed veterans, usually alongside their transition from active service. Like Fawn, I am Shoshone Bannock.
Thanks, Furman. And I want to appreciate the fact that many of us on here are veterans, and that complements the work we're doing at Hesperus. And we'll talk about a couple of issues affecting Native American veterans and Indigenous veterans as they transition from the service. So I want to throw it open in the beginning to talk about recruiting. It's important for our audience and for those of us who may not be in talent acquisition to understand what companies are looking for when they recruit Native Americans, but more importantly, how to do it well. So I'm going to put Tyler on the spot first and have him talk a little bit about Nike's recruiting program and some of those engagement efforts, and then we'll go around the horn and discuss that with everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt. I think one of the things that is really important that we understand at Nike and that we've really been working on cultivating this idea is that recruitment has to start with building trust and relationship within the Native community. And I think that all of us in the companies that we're representing have an opportunity, to build those relationships, to build that trust, and to really invest in Native communities. And I think that's a great place to start when we think about how do we recruit Native talent, and how do we create this sort of corporate pathway or pipeline that doesn't currently exist, because it means we have to understand these barriers while at the same time investing and providing resources to these communities that we wish to partner with. And I think at Nike, that's something that we do in various ways. So we have, many of you may have heard of Nike N7. So the N7 brand is committed to providing access to sport and physical activity to Native American, Aboriginal, First Nation youth. And I think that's a way that we've really helped build awareness within the Native community, but also at Nike to help us support Native athletes, but also to build a brand that truly represents Indigenous people, that represents Indigenous talent. So when they think of Nike, they think of Nike N7, and they think of us as a place that they may want to work. So for me, that's a start, and that's a way that that Nike has been building the relationship and trust with Native communities, for a while now. On top of that, when specifically to recruitment efforts, is something we call supporting pathways to corporate. And we're doing this in a few different ways right now. One being partnering with the American Indian Sciences and Engineering organization through ACES, having a partnership and a presence there, utilizing our university relations team to make sure that we are recruiting from tribal colleges and universities. And then also a retail pathway where we are partnering with local tribes in the areas where we have a retail presence to help create a retail pathway for Native talent to maybe start their career or make those career changes, and then making sure that we're supporting, growing, educating, and developing those retail employees so that they may have a pathway to Nike corporate.
Fantastic. And, I saw a note come up in the chat that it's the Nike N7 Foundation. And not only is it really influential, and I learned a lot about it at the Footprint Summit last year, but a lot of cool stuff too. There's some great items there. Fawn, I'd like you to talk a little bit about what Amazon is doing in the space. Amazon as a company is in the news quite a bit, and you are everywhere. Your reach is everywhere. So I'd like to know what you're doing to recruit and attract Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, so the Indigenous Amazon Affinity Group is only 3 years old, so we are quite young. When we first launched, we talked a lot about our 3-year plan, established some pretty hefty goals, but the biggest thing we wanted to focus on first was employee engagement and building our network of Indigenous employees and allies within the company. So in short, we needed to get members, we needed to build chapters. So we worked really hard at that during the last 3 years. We've had several Indigenous Peoples' Day celebrations and Native American Heritage Months. If you were on Amazon.com during any of those events in the last in October and November, then you saw some reading lists and some Prime Video lists as well. So we're going to continue to do those things just to keep expanding and raising awareness. Another space that we've really gotten deep into this last year is really professional organizations and reaching out to organizations like ACES and SACNIS. And so for the last 2 years, Amazon's actually been recognized in the Winds of Change ACES magazine as one of the top 50 STEM employers for Indigenous people. So we're really proud of that achievement. But beyond just STEM careers, there's so much more that you can do at Amazon. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize. We do have several other job families. I myself work mostly in program management and learning and design. So there's a lot of space for both entry into the workforce and some of our student and university programs, but also going opportunities, I think, for people that are already established in their careers and looking for something that's even outside of a STEM field as well. So there's a lot happening. We've also just launched our chapters in New Zealand and Australia and Canada. So we've really expanded beyond that Native American focus into that larger Indigenous focus, which has reached a lot more employees, but also communities. As Tyler said, I think that's a really important part of what's next for us.
That's great. And I see that with a lot of global brands, is that broadening of the big tent concept. So that's great, and congrats on all your progress. I know you guys have grown a lot in a short time. Furman, I'd be interested to know what you're doing at DocuSign, and really one thing I would love to ask you is if you could provide some background on tribal colleges and universities. If you could tell me a little bit about that. A lot of people are familiar with HBCUs and HBCU recruiting, but for you and for the group, I'd love to hear about TCUs.
Matt, very quickly, I think I might be the wrong member of the panel to ask as far as TCUs, and also with regards to DocuSign. I'm on the sales team. So, but with that, I do have some thoughts just from the military perspective and where we see there. So typically, and it's been both anecdotally my experience and the data shows, Native Americans are widely underrepresented in technology companies. I think I saw a stat somewhere that was 0.37% of the U.S. workforce at Apple, but at the same time, Native Americans serve at 5 times the normal rate compared to other communities in the military. So, with that kind of coming out and what we've been doing on the military side to assist with this transition effort is the building of mentorship. Representation builds upon itself. So for those of us who've been in the startup world and managed to be both, the sum total of both the Native American population and the military population working for a tech company, it's a very lonely position. So, taking those extra steps one-on-one when people, are coming from one community, whether it's a Native American community, the military, and trying to go to what is oftentimes a very foreign environment, which is technology. I did it. It was not great. Having those people like Fawn, who I called to ask the difference between UX and UI and start those translations, which leads to, okay, maybe I can be a member of this community. And then that's something that kind of grows upon itself. So there's been sort of a grassroots effort that the military recognizes and is putting funding in to just trying to increase that across the board.
I think that intersectionality is important with veterans and Native Americans. I also think there are other groups that also intersect here. And I think it's important for people to understand there are multiple routes and paths into a company or into an industry, right? And we need to look at all those paths, whether they're on the career page or we know about them through referrals, different ways to continue to network, expand, and get referred into a company in addition to normal recruiting pathways. So I think that's important. And that's a focus of Hesperus too, Native American veterans and tying their service in with their pathway to a corporate career. Clay, what can you talk to me a little bit about what Cisco is doing in this space? I'm familiar with your Cyber Vets program, but I don't know too much about Native American recruiting at Cisco.
Matt, I know that in the short time I've been there, we've seen the Native American Network ERO expand and grow, trying to reach out to the TCUs. We have well, it's not a partnership, but we do recruiting at UNC Pembroke, which backstory is still sort of a quasi TCU. It was an Indian school, and then it was Pembroke State University, and now it's wrapped up into the UNC system. But still the majority of what go there are members of the Lumbee tribe. So being in North Carolina, we work closely with them, and a lot of the members of the Native American ERO at Cisco are Lumbee. So that's been working. We've also just started this year working with ACES to try to get on some of their job boards and try to become a corporate sponsor, just to reach out and let the Native community know that, hey, Cisco is here. We've got a very small organization that we're trying to spread the word, but we're working hard and we're spreading it slowly but surely.
Fantastic. And I see some notes about tribal colleges and universities, the listing of the 37, 34, which are accredited in the United States. I see those coming up in the chat, so I appreciate us. Those of you that are doing a little extra work, Lisa Nobles and others that are helping us get our work done here. So a company near and dear to my heart, Microsoft, I know that they have efforts in diversity recruiting. Heather, if you could talk a little bit about what Microsoft is doing to attract Native American talent into its operations around the country.
Yeah, similar to Fawn and some of the approach that Amazon's taken, more recently, we actually rebranded our employee resource group to be Indigenous ERG, which was historically and previously called NAMERS, the Native American Resource Group. And as part of that rebranding, really, we've put some effort and funding into making sure that we went out with a marketing campaign. We actually took photography of our active Indigenous participants as part of ERG, and investing in publications where we can meet recent graduates, students, as well as investing in some of the publications of some of the key tribes across the country. So really a concerted advocacy effort coming from our local Indigenous ERG group within Microsoft to be proactive, to put out some of those ad campaigns so that really Native people and Indigenous across the globe can start to see themselves in the tech industry, with kind of the mantra of, you know, if you don't first see yourself represented, make sure that we're showing that diverse representation in some of those publications. And I'm continuing to see that advocacy go forth with HR in our local organizations and our local teams. And I think you've heard from the panel, you know, it's a relatively small group sometimes within these larger tech organizations. So we band together, we share with one another leads and job opportunities. And when we have students or folks coming out of the military who are doing that transition, we're going to share with one another via our, you know, email aliases and continue to advocate internally with that network. So for those folks on today's call, I just encourage, you know, if you are of Native descent or know others interested in getting in the tech industry, you know, we can all act as that advocate within our own organizations as well, because that networking piece of it, that advocacy work that's being done by the ERGs is so critical to this opportunity.
Fantastic. So I'm gonna, you know, I promised the panel that I would be direct about things that were challenges as well as opportunities. So one thing I'll throw out is what can we do better? What can we do better in our companies to recruit Native talent more effectively, in larger numbers, more thoroughly? That's my question for the group, and I'd open it up to anybody.
I'll go ahead, Matt. I think it really is that advocacy of the statistics and information. We were just talking about TCUs, and often we're talking about within our own companies, historically Black universities and colleges and other opportunities where recruitment efforts can be very targeted. And I think it's about educating and informing. So often I meet people or talk about my own heritage and background, and people just simply don't know. They don't have the information. They, in many cases, maybe have actually never met a Native American. I don't know about other panelists, but I often get asked, "What are you?" my whole life. And then when I tell them, they're like, "Wow, I've never actually met a real live Native American," which is somewhat an interesting and awkward conversation. But for Native people, I think it can be somewhat common. And so I think it is actually part of that education and providing that information. Furman, I think it was you that tossed out a stat of the population within your organization of less than 0.3%, if I heard that right, of the Native population. And I think it's important to continue to talk about those statistics within our companies, talk about the underrepresentation, and also talk about the representation that does exist at TCUs and within certain fields across the country where there are Native Americans doing really amazing work, getting amazing educations, and just really being able to speak about that and prop it up.
Great. Tyler, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I'd love to add. I think Heather is spot on with what she's saying, and I think the next piece that I would love for everyone on this call to know, especially if you work in talent acquisition, you work in talent management, is making the ask and putting the pressure on your company, on your employer, on your HR organizations to say, if we don't have a strategy for recruiting Native talent, let's build one. And I think that, for a lot of the folks on this panel and people on this call, I'm sure that we've all been around, those types of conversations, whether it's starting a new ERG and creating a safe space where we can build community with other Indigenous people in the workplace, or when it comes to creating these partnerships with TCUs, with organizations like ACES, investing in our communities, investing in Native students, so that we actually build a robust and comprehensive strategy that involves Native talent. I know that for Nike, for Microsoft, for Amazon, we have reports around demographics and data that show the representation of our companies. And if we say that representation matters, we need to do a better job of increasing the representation of Indigenous people at our companies. And I think that employee resource groups are a wonderful place to start, and we build a lot of great, community strategy, programming, branding, messaging to help share our culture and to help highlight some of the stories of the amazing things Indigenous people are doing around the country. But I think that the thing that can be missing, and the thing I would like everyone to know on this, is if there's, there has to be a true recruitment strategy in place. And I think it takes folks like us, people who have joined this call, whether you're Indigenous or an ally, stepping up and having those hard conversations, asking our employers, if this recruitment strategy doesn't exist, why not, and how do we build one?
I agree, and that's a challenge, I think, for a lot of different groups, underserved groups that are, in corporate America. What I hear most from folks that are recruiting professionals when we talk about the lack of a Native American recruiting strategy in a large company, and I've been with two of them, is, well, Native American recruiting doesn't scale, which, we've discussed this before. It's a slap in the face. It's also, I think, directly opposite what folks who are diversity and inclusion professionals say about everyone, is that everyone matters and everyone should be a part of it. But this group, it doesn't yield the numbers for employees that we should invest in them. I think it's a tough pill to swallow. I know it's not true. And I think we can all do much better work, especially leadership and talent acquisition, to address that issue. I want to kind of segue into something you mentioned, Tyler. And this, again, is for everyone. So we spend a lot of time and effort in some companies to recruit talent And I know from my own experience with where I went to college, we could recruit Native Americans. We had a really hard time retaining Native Americans. I think this is a challenge for the tech industry with a lot of underserved groups. But I want to address the fact that we need to retain the talent that we work so hard to find. What are some strategies and some work you do, both inside the ERG and through corporate engagement, to keep your folks engaged and keep them a part of all your efforts and have them grow to find a career in your company? And I'll open that up to anybody on the panel, but I'm really interested to talk about retention.
One of the questions in the IM window that I think relates to this, I think it looks like it's Zachary Rosencotter. He said, how do I create an ERG? I'd love to create one, but I'm not of Indigenous heritage. I think those ERGs are just a phenomenal way to create that connection within an organization that can really help with retention, because when you have that sense of community, when you can share dialogue and anecdotes like we are today, that really starts to strengthen the bond, commitment, and loyalty to any organization. And what I would say, and Matt, maybe you can speak to this, is that I'm supportive of an ally starting an Indigenous resource group. I think anytime we can get people together who have the same commitment, who have allyship, who have heritage, that's a win-win for everybody. And Matt, I think you're a great example of an ally starting an organization that can help bring us together as well. So for me, I'm supportive, and I think somebody like Zachary starting an ERG at his company as an ally would be well supported.
Agree 100%. Clay?
I've only been at Cisco for a little while, but I can speak to this on a personal level. My first 4 months at Cisco, I enjoyed it, but I was lost. I had spent 23 years on the Army, in leadership roles and on teams, and there was a sense of unity, of camaraderie, something banding us all together. And then I went to Cisco and was one of 100,000 across the world, and I didn't feel like I had anywhere to belong. I didn't have a team. Then I found the Native American Network, and now, whereas I may have been looking for somewhere else to go, now I have a sense of belonging. Now I have a team that I'm a part of, and I'm doing more than just getting a paycheck. I am moving forward, trying to reach out to other, natives and enabling them, bringing more into the fold, trying to get more to come in and be a part. So I think, that's one of the things that, Ermine hit on with service. We as a people need to serve a greater good. It's not enough for us to just collect a paycheck. We have a greater calling, a greater sense of responsibility.
Absolutely, Clay. Fawn, can you talk a little bit about what Amazon's doing? You guys have done such a good job in your Indigenous Peoples group, but I'd love to know some things maybe around professional development or mentorship. Anything you'd like.
Yeah, you read my mind, Matt, and yeah, Clay got me thinking a little bit. I think about that a lot, just for myself personally. That I think it is important to find a way to give back. I'm really fortunate to be in the role that I am right now at my company, and so it's really important to me to find ways to create other development opportunities and career paths for both veterans and anybody from an underserved community. One thing that I'm really passionate about is mentorship within companies. I think that's really important, and every time we have a recruitment discussion around Native American or veteran recruiting or any other community, I always bring that up. Recruiting is nice, but what's next? What about those first 90 days of onboarding? How are we engaging these new hires? And then how are we helping them to develop once they are in the role? I think that we do need to have ways for them to establish career paths and sort of grow them from within, so to speak. At Amazon, we have a lot of really great entry-level programs for university hires, for example. So I would love to just take that opportunity to really grow them into long-term career professionals at Amazon and move them into those managerial positions as well. I think a lot of that also will bring representation. That's just so important. And Heather talked about being sort of the first and maybe the only Native American person that people have ever met. I've definitely been in that position too. And that does come with a lot of pressure, especially if you don't know anyone else in your leadership chain that looks like you or comes from a similar background. So I think that representation is really important, and that's a big piece of retention, along with having mentorship and providing career growth opportunities internally. So I know that's something that we're really going to be focusing on, or continuing our focus on in what we're doing at Amazon.
So I invite anyone else on the panel to talk about what they found from a retention standpoint. I think all these resonate with a lot of underserved groups. What I find is so important about ERGs for Native American groups is just the numbers are a lot smaller, and so they become much more important, as Clay mentioned. It's a much bigger deal to find people like you in the same room and to reach out to them. What are some corporate engagement strategies companies can use? We have these ERGs, we have folks willing to serve, ready to serve. How should they use that potential and the people that want to clearly engage in their community? What are some ways that they can harness that energy, that goodwill, and that service as they engage their customers, their communities? What are some ways that Native Americans can do that through their companies?
I'll speak a little bit about what we're doing at Nike. Like I mentioned when we started this conversation, is that building trust and building relationships with Native communities is incredibly important in creating this pathway and this relationship with our companies, whether it's Fortune 500 companies or smaller businesses. And I think that no matter where you're located or the size of your company, everyone is on Indigenous land, and everyone is around Indigenous communities. You may not know it, and you may not be able to identify who the Indigenous people are, but throughout North America, that is our reality. And so I think that building relationship, building trust, and investing your time and your resources with these communities is a great way to start earning that trust and also building those pathways into your company. And so I think that one of the things that we've done is partnering with our local Native organizations that really do a great job of supporting our local Indigenous communities. So we have the Native American Youth and Family Association here in Portland, Oregon. It is a K through 12 school, as well as a food pantry. They offer family planning. They offer financial guidance and planning. They really have a number of services that they do with the intent of serving the Indigenous community locally. And so for Nike, we've partnered with them, investing grant dollars into their organization to help them continue this programming and continue supporting this community. And then something that I think ties into the retention as well, and obviously this was pre-pandemic, but because there's so many students there and so many kids there, we use the opportunity and leverage what we have at Nike, which is sport and physical activity, to host a lot of events with these kids, and we'd have them invite their families and their brothers and sisters, their relatives, kids that maybe didn't go to the NAIA school, have them bring other students with them to engage in really just really fun activities. And I think that it's helped retain a lot of our employees because they've had such positive experiences, both Native and non-Native employees at Nike, by interacting with these Native youth. And it's also helped us to earn trust in the local Native community when they see a company like Nike showing up, investing in their communities, putting dollars behind the programs that they have to support Indigenous people. But again, building that trust and building those relationships.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to add to that about how they engage with local communities? And this is different from our business outreach. I know Microsoft does work through the Airband initiative at the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. I know other companies here are doing engagement work, but about through your ERGs, what are some other outlets?
Hey, Matt, I just wanted to kind of put a plug out there for the Amazon Future Engineer Program. This is something that everybody should absolutely look into. It's something that you can bring to any tribal community or underserved community. And it is something that our affinity group has also partnered with. We've done a few coding camps where we bring either the coding camps to the tribal communities or we bus them over to the Amazon headquarters and do a bit of a tour. It's also a nice way to just meet some of the Indigenous employees for some high school students or college students and just get to know them and see what career paths are in. But definitely check out the Amazon Future Engineer program. That's a great way to do things like coding camps and bring technology help to some of these underserved communities. And I'll go ahead and post that link in the chat.
And for Microsoft, we've been actively involved in Microsoft DigiGirls. Most recently, even within the last week, we held a half-day event for Indigenous children, actually globally, which was a great opportunity. And then more locally, many of our school districts have local Native children groups within the school districts that allows for more community building and engagement of Native and Indigenous children within the school districts, which our Indigenous ERG has been a part of as well. So I think a lot of local activity that doesn't just span in the US or America, but expands globally to Canada, New Zealand, Australia. So really taking advantage of that global opportunity to bring engagement with Indigenous peoples worldwide.
Fantastic. So I want to broach a subject that's a little touchy, and we came upon it when we discussed this as a panel earlier this week, and I would love to discuss this in this group format. So we've seen a lot of emphasis around social justice and around engagement of underserved communities, especially in the last year. What I see in the diversity and inclusion community is a lot of diversity, not necessarily a lot of inclusion on an equity basis, right? So we have a lot of individuals that we want to highlight and we want to recruit, but corporations don't necessarily give the same resources or put the same emphasis towards some groups over others. And I noticed that specifically around the Native American community. So I'd like to talk about what Tyler introduced, which is, one, we see that this is happening, and two, what can we do as individuals and as people in our companies to help fix that problem? And I want to take the step to say, I know it's a problem. I have conversations with D&I professionals all the time. And if we go on any major Fortune 500 company's website and we look at their diversity inclusion page and we look at who's represented, but also our categories, what percentage of employees are made up from certain groups. Sometimes Native Americans are considered the other category or they don't get a category at all. So I want to talk a little bit around this larger issue about representation, but more importantly, how can we help solve that?
I think the first thing that I want to mention is, I think it's important to have advocacy across all underrepresented groups and just to kind of always lift all boats. But with that being said, I think that, again, from my own personal experience, it is about that continuous advocacy. It is about that continuous building of community of other Native people, of other Indigenous people. And that's why I'm thrilled that Microsoft decided to go the route of expanding our ERG to be the Indigenous ERG, to be inclusive globally and to increase that representation and sense of community. But it always, for me, goes back to education, which is educating those that are part of the HR community, that are part of the D&I community about some of the challenges, obstacles, and setbacks, that our Native community has. And that's why this panel today is, I think, so important, is just to continue to advocate for our people, advocate for the statistics, bring forth that information to educate. And also just kind of going back to making sure that we're having our D&I leaders and some of the reports and reporting and ROI and metrics that it does represent, so that there is at least an indicator and a benchmark and a starting place to start to have those conversations for those that choose to indicate that they are of Native heritage. And Matt, you do bring up a good point that how many times have the panelists, filled out a form and we end up filling out other when we would prefer to self-identify as Native American or otherwise.
Fantastic. Does anybody else want to add to that? I think it's an important topic that we kind of got started on the other night and we didn't finish.
I mean, I'd like to reiterate, the point again about, we have to have difficult conversations with ourselves, with our colleagues, with our managers, with leadership of the companies that we represent, in order to push this work forward. And I think, Clay made a really great comment about, we as people, we want to serve something bigger and greater than just ourselves. And I think that if people feel inspired to serve in a way that is increasing representation of diverse and underrepresented communities in their workspace, that we have to be willing to have those difficult conversations. Like Heather mentioned, our ERGs do an incredible job of building community and building a space where people feel welcome, where they feel like they belong, where they feel like they have other people who look like them or may have similar backgrounds. But it has to be bigger than that, right? We have to look at the statistics. We have to of representation at our companies, but also understanding the realities of the struggles and issues that Indigenous people face every day in America. And I think that if we have the ability to do something about it, the ability to make the lives of Indigenous people better, and at the same time increase the representation of Native people in our companies, that's really what we should be doing. And I think we, together collectively can work with one another to leverage the power and the resources of the companies and the brands that we represent to really do that.
Absolutely. Anyone else?
Yeah, Matt, I just want to double down on the concept of calling the baby ugly. We have to look at numbers. Putting 0.37%, if you're at Apple, putting that on your website doesn't look good. People are going to not be likely to do that. And, having those uncomfortable conversations and putting it, out and putting it on the website and encouraging our executives and our coworkers to have these open conversations. A lot of times, whether you're talking Native American people or veterans, and I'll always bring it back there, underrepresented groups are foreign. They're, you don't really have a lot of just understanding of other groups' individual context. So, having spent time at a large corporation and time at much smaller startup, when you have smaller groups, they're just less and less likely. I think I saw a question like, how does this reflect in smaller companies? The percentages get smaller, and 0.37 is not a person when you're not there. You're just not going to see it. So, being able to and willing to find the people who are able to have those conversations and put that data out there at least gives everyone a kind of a starting look to say, like, that's an ugly baby. Great, now we can work. We have a spot to work from.
I like that that message, and I've got to be careful about it, right? You got to be very diplomatic when you're talking about ugly babies. So I appreciate that, Furman. I agree with you, and I think my experience is directly with the veteran space. It's also with the LGBTQ space, and I think sometimes these conversations can be tough. But if not us, then who's going to have that conversation? Who's going to lead that? So we're about a quarter of, and I wanted to engage with Charissa. I know we had some questions come up in the chat, but I want to open it up to general questions and answers from our audience. I think we're at around, I know we had almost 250 people register for today's panel, which is fantastic. I really appreciate that. And so I'd love to give people a chance to ask some specific questions if they can. Charissa, if you can identify some questions, or if folks want to post them in the chat right now, we can throw them open to our panel for about 10 minutes.
Hi, Matt. Yes, I see a few questions from our chat room. It looks like the first one we had is actually for our audience. The question was, any members of cooperatives here? And this was from Patrick Connolly.
And I'm not sure I fully understand that question as a cooperative. I'm not sure what they're talking about. If someone else does, that would be great. And if not, we can engage with them directly later. Okay. I see a great question that just came up. How can we best determine which Native American tribes may be in our local area? Tyler mentioned this. And Tyler, I know you talked about a link that you had before. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that nativelands.ca is a great resource. The Canadian nonprofit has done really incredible work to create an interactive map where you can look at the traditional lands of Native American communities, regardless of where you live. I sent something in the chat earlier, but you can use the text bot. You just text your zip code or your city and state, and it will respond with the names of the Native communities who traditionally lived where we live and reside now. And again, that nativeland.ca, the Canadian nonprofit, has done a really great job. And I think it's helpful for us, regardless of the size of the companies that we represent on this call, to understand, the traditional land that we're on and the history of those people as we do business in those spaces. So that's a great and really easy to use resource.
Yeah, and I noticed that I saw the link. We'll include that in the email that comes out after our panel. We'll make sure we include that link as well as the others that have been mentioned here that folks can use for URL to engage with that. Thanks, Tyler. Charissa, you got any other questions for us?
I don't see any more in the chat room at the moment. It looks like we already touched on a few of them earlier. We did have a question earlier that mentioned that all of our panelists, most of our panelists are from large companies. How do some of these issues apply to small or smaller businesses? And I believe Tyler touched on that a bit, that either way, whether it's big company or small company, just any working in a collaborative sense is going to help touch the issue.
Yeah, and I know Furman mentioned it too. I think one of the most important things we can all realize that as we need to identify ourselves as advocates and allies, whether we're in the community, associated with the community, no matter what our role is, we need to make sure that we put that out publicly, whether it's on our LinkedIn profile or not. Sometimes just having a tribal affiliation or allyship statement on there is very, very important to wave the flag. And then we need to follow up on that and be strong representatives and allies in that sense. And I'm interested to hear, if anybody has any thoughts on that, about how you self-identify in a public manner, how do you get the word out, and how do you really broach and engage your referral network? We all come in contact with people all the time, but we want to make sure that we stand as an ally or as an advocate for our people. So, how do we do that? If anybody has any thoughts on that, that would be great.
Matt, it leads me to a good segue that we had talked about when we were prepping for this, which is, some of the profiling activity that happens just innately with recruiting. I mean, that's just a natural part of the recruiting process. And it always reminds me of how many LinkedIn messages I have from recruiters who just happen to add on and can you tell me more about your heritage, or they're probing, right? They want to know. And so one of the ways I've been able to indicate is through LinkedIn and joining certain Native groups and my own tribe on LinkedIn to try and more proactively affiliate. But it brings me also to the question, and I'm curious how Fawn and Furman might answer this, is when some of those profiling activities happen, Fawn and Furman have what is historically a Hispanic last name. I'm curious to hear how they might respond to that as well. But I think it's important to, proactively self-indicate when you can.
Yeah, I'll definitely let Furman touch on this too, because it's almost a running joke between us. We both get a lot of messages that, start off with hola. And I'm like, I don't speak Spanish, I'm sorry. It is a Spanish name, and we are from the Texas area. But I think that's touchy. And I think it's something to remember with recruiting. And there's so much sort of historical trauma tied to identification of being Native American and being Indigenous. It's a question that I get a lot as a lead of an affinity group, even, that people are wondering even if they can join, and they'll even declare they're quantum to me sometimes. Like, I'm only a quarter Native American. Can I still join the group? Or I'm only half Native American. Am I even eligible to be here at this recruiting panel or at this recruiting event? And it's something that we're really careful in our verbiage about, to just make sure that it's really inclusive. We're absolutely staying away from words such as, you know, tribal affiliation or enrolled member or registered or anything like that, especially because there are so many both federal and non-federally recognized tribes, both here in the United States and elsewhere. And we also work with candidates from all over the world who come from many Indigenous backgrounds. So we're really careful with the verbiage. And I think that's really important, to just create that inclusive space, because a lot of people do identify as Native American or Indigenous, but still may think that they may not qualify for things like this. So they still aren't reaching out for these opportunities. But then on the other side of it, like Heather said, you do have those recruiters that are really sort of aggressive and forceful and trying to probe and see if you meet that sort of profile they're looking for.
Yeah, and I will say, you know, coming to this community, and Furman, I'm going to tag you right after this, coming to this community later in life, is that I think a lot of folks are afraid they're going to break some rules, especially in the current climate around, you know, diversity, inclusion, and unconscious bias, you know, you name it. A lot of people want to make sure they don't say the wrong thing, and therefore they don't say anything. They don't reach out. They don't talk about what they're doing or how they're doing or how you can be a part of that. So I think it's really important that we recognize that. But ultimately, you know, the key is education. Sorry, Furman, I didn't mean to cut you off.
All good. I was just going to add, sometimes you just have to tell people. I mean, the fact is, I moved from Seattle, or moved back to Seattle from Austin last year, and I speak more Pashto than I do Spanish. And you know, like, you're gonna get some confusion. You're going to have some things that are awkward, and whether it's the pronunciation of someone's name or anything you want to know, sometimes you have to just ask people, hey, what's the right way to pronounce your name? And sometimes you have to tell people, yeah, I'm Native, dude. Like, don't know what to tell you, and just put it out there.
Yeah, I think it's important to live our own truth, you know, and say exactly, put it on the table and let them deal with that, rather than trying to be to tap dance around it. And I think that goes for everybody. Absolutely, it's imperative for us to bring our whole selves, bring our full selves to work, and that makes it easier for us to find our allies. It makes it easier to find other folks who will work with us and will understand us, and ultimately help us attract more talent into the companies we all work for. So that being said, I want to take some time here really quickly. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give us a call to action before I wrap up, and any final comments from each of them. I really appreciate everyone's time today. And then I'm going to close out with a little bit about Hesperus and what we're doing in this space. I would like for Tyler to lead us off here with a call to action for everyone that's in our audience.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. One thing I'd like to leave everyone with, and I know I've mentioned this a few times now, but it really is important to me, is if you don't currently have a strategy, or at least an understanding of, you know, how many Indigenous people, you know, work at your company, you know, start having those difficult conversations with your coworkers, with your managers, you know, really with whoever you need to, so that you can, you know, start to build a plan, and, you know, more importantly, build a community, because, you know, Indigenous people should be represented everywhere. And I think that everyone on this call obviously has a will to make that happen, and wants to help support, you know, Native people and Indigenous communities, and they want to do that in their workspace. And you know, my call to action would be, if you don't currently have that plan, or you're unaware of that plan at your company, you know, have that conversation with someone, right? Like, start tomorrow, start this week, start having those conversations to, you know, figure out what you can do, either as an ally or as an Indigenous person, to help build community and to help increase representation of Native people at your company. And my shameless plug here is, I did see Adonis mentioned, you know, anyone working on cross-corporate collaborations. I think that what Matt is doing here at Hesperus is really incredible, bringing, you know, folks who are representing Native people and Indigenous people in these corporate spaces is truly incredible. At Nike, we do something similar with our Footprint Summit. We're going to be hosting our Footprint Summit 2.0, which will be virtual this year. And so I hope that for those who are interested in this work and continuing to push this mission forward, that you all will join us as we continue these conversations and collaborate to help increase representation of Native people.
Thanks, Tyler. And I'll repeat again, I got my start on the idea for a program like this from the Footprint Summit. It was one of the best things I attended in the last couple of years. It was fantastic. Fawn, I'm going to put you on the spot. Fawn, if you want to close us out with what you all are doing and your call to action.
You know, I think what's really important, both with recruiting and the type of support that we want to offer for our customers to make our products more inclusive, is to really get in there and understand who these communities are. And I think that applies both to the veteran community, the Native American community, and really any underserved population. Tyler spoke about it a little bit in the beginning, how important it is to cultivate relationships with these local communities. And I think that's really critical, especially with recruiting and getting Native American people into the workforce, veterans as well, that the issues that affect a community are going to be very different from community to community. Some people, you know, really have infrastructure issues or socioeconomic needs that other people may not have. And it's going to be really important to commit to supporting them and establishing long-term relationships as well. So that would be the call to action that I would ask everyone here to really commit to. You can't just try to get them into your workforce and get them out of those homelands. You really have to commit to supporting their communities and getting to know them and understand the issues that affect them.
Absolutely. Thank you. Clay, I realize you went off to the next page for me, so I hope you don't feel I forgot you. I would love to hear your call to action and what you'd like us to take away from this.
Oh, wow, Matt. That's, I don't know. I guess because I may come from a different perspective than some of the other panelists, because for me, I came to my Native heritage a little bit later, because even though two of my great grandmothers, you know, one was Cherokee, one was Seminole, when they married white men and left their communities, they ceased to exist. So even though I'm obviously not white, up until like, you know, 10 or 11 years old, oh, I'm white, oh, I'm white. Well, get out of college and people are like, dude, what are you? Because you're not white. And I'm like, well, blah, blah, blah. And so it took me a long time, you know, personally to call to action myself and, you know, just recognize and reconcile with who I was. And yes, you know, what I would tell people is it gets old after a while, but don't be afraid to ask me what I am, because I'll tell you. I mean, you can assume or you can just ask. I'd a whole lot rather you just ask who I am than make an assumption. And as far as, I'm going to do a little different call to action. I'm going to reach out to your service members or anyone else that's looking to get into a position. All of these companies, well, all of the ones today, there's going to be other natives there. Get into that company's website, find where they are, you know, find the ERGs, find the EROs, find a community that you can belong to and work the network from behind the scenes. You know, don't wait for a recruiter to ask you. Put it out there, put them on blast, say, you need to hire me and this is what I'm bringing to the table.
No, I think that's a great idea. Begin your networking before you need to interview. Engage those folks ahead of time. I know none of us here would mind at all if someone reached out to us and asked us, hey, what is Microsoft or Nike or Amazon or anyone else looking for in their employees, and how can I connect with other people like me in your company? I know that no one here would mind reaching out to someone and talking about that. Furman, what's your call to action? What should we do?
Less a call to action, more of an opportunity. If you're a hiring manager or looking to increase your population of Native Americans, minorities in general, look at your veteran population, your veteran applicants. It's a massive pool of talent of people. Once again, you know, especially coming on the enlisted ranks, overrepresented by Native Americans, well-trained, great background of service, lots of soft skills. There's going to be some trading uplift, obviously, at the start, but it's a phenomenal pool of talent that is ready, willing, and coming out of the workforce. That's just a fantastic opportunity that is under-tapped, especially in technology. And that's something that we see. And then one last thing, if you do onboardings with new people, what's your spirit animal icebreaker? Let's just all agree to cut that out. My God.
I've never, ever suggested that. I just want to go on record and say I've never suggested that.
The worst.
All right. Thanks, Furman. And last, Heather, I'd love to hear your closing thoughts on your call to action around this topic.
Yeah, I actually have two. The first one is if any of you are part of any kind of an organization, to ask the probing questions when the topic of D&I comes up, when we're talking about initiatives to help programmatically with underserved and underrepresented communities. Ask the question, what about Native Americans? What about Indigenous peoples? Because often that category of people gets left off the list. So I would invite everybody on this call to just ask the question so that it can raise awareness and we can continue to have these conversations and educate. And then number two is help be a bridge. We have five or six panelists today. We would love to be the bridge. So if you know a Native American or Indigenous person looking for work, looking for opportunities, looking for coaching or mentorship, many of us are part of our ERGs. We can help be the bridge and make those connections happen. All about connecting people. And I would just invite everyone on this call to feel free to be my connection on LinkedIn, and I'd love to hear from you and help be the bridge.
Awesome, and thank you very much. I want to close with a plug for Hesperus, for the organization that has brought us together. I founded Hesperus so that we could serve the Native American community, especially in rural and tribal communities, through education, employment, and technology to create a path for individuals to take part in the 21st century and the digital jobs that we all know are there. COVID has heightened in stark contrast to the opportunities that these jobs had for those of us that are able to work remotely and to work from home, and some of us who have no choice in the matter. That is really going to be a long-term investment, and we'll focus on new technologies, whether it's IT, medical technology, drone technology, or even alternative energy. But I think it's important for us to pave the way and create not only employment paths, but career fields with mentors and job opportunities to serve this community tomorrow and next year, and so on and so forth. I think it's important. And I would invite all of you. I saw Mike put a link in the chat window about what Hesperus is and our website. I would invite all of you to follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And I also invite all of you to engage with us either as a mentor, to support us as a partner, or to help us out in any way that you think you can. We're growing our program, and our summit program will launch this summer, which will be our first cohort for IT skills training for Native American veterans. And I appreciate if you signed up for our newsletter, as well as check out our website to learn more. Together we can get a lot more done than we can singly. With that being said, I just want to say thank you so much to all my panelists. Everyone I asked jumped on board with no hesitation, and I'm really overwhelmed by the amount of expertise and experience that my panel has. And lastly, I want to say thanks to Teresa and Mike for putting on a great panel today. We will send out an email after the event, and we'll also have an edited video that is a recording for this event that we'll send to everyone that registered, as well as have it on our website. So please share that with anyone and everyone you know that would be interested in this. Thank you again from Hesperus, and I hope everyone enjoyed tonight's presentation. Have a great night.